Well, hello again, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I'm coming to you today from the transporter room because the transporter room is where we generally explore. We will sometimes use the shuttles if the transporter is unavailable or can't be used. But generally, we use the transporter when we're going to explore Class M, typically a Class M planet. And as it turns out, today we're going to talk about the Jefferson administration. And Jefferson had quite a penchant for exploration, especially of the West as well. And so we'll talk about that, talk about the Corps of Discovery, the Lewis and Clark expedition, um, as we talk about his presidency. So let's pick it up with the undeclared war between France and the United States at the end of the Adams administration. And you remember that in that time, the Adams administration took advantage of that undeclared war and passed some laws that were meant to curtail the power of the Democratic Republicans. And so that led to this whole kerfuffle leading up to the election of 1800. And this was a raucous election. There was what was called mudslinging on both sides. Both candidates accused each other of all sorts of different things. Jefferson was accused of being an atheist, which was a big deal back then, that he was going to destroy the government if he was able to be elected, and Adams was criticized as a prickly, cold leader that was in cahoots with England and all sorts of things. So that was the atmosphere as we get into the election of 1800. Now, electoral votes were very important back then. This is before the 12th Amendment. So electoral votes are by candidate, not by ticket. So there wasn't a president and vice president ticket in each party. It was the person that got the most electoral votes became president, and the person with the second most electoral votes became vice president. You can imagine how contentious that would be. And so the Adams and Jefferson are squaring off, and they had a contentious relationship. Their relationship kind of fell off years before this. John Adams writes to Abigail about this from France and England earlier on. But they did not have a good personal relationship. And so that bled into the infighting in the election. So what happens is that Jefferson will create this scheme to get the electoral votes from New York, because he has the South, but the South doesn't have the population of the North, of New England especially, and so he knows that he needs New York in order to win this election. And so what he does is he secretly gets together with a guy named Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr was kind of an up-and-coming politician who actually had plans to try and take over the United States and make himself a king. That leads to the assassination of Aaron Burr, and with the duel and all that stuff later on. But that's Aaron Burr. Now, Jefferson is in league with Aaron Burr. He said, if you work with me in this election, I will throw my electoral votes, some of my electoral votes your way, and you throw one of them away, and then I'll become president and you become vice president, and we will win this thing. Well, this was Burr's opportunity to get into government, and so he doesn't do that. He makes it essentially a tie between Jefferson and Burr, and so things have to go into the House of Representatives. It was quite a mess. And actually led to the 12th Amendment being ratified in 1804, which is the system that we still have today. All right, so what happens is it goes into the House of Representatives. This will happen again in 1824, as we will see, but those are the only two times that the electoral college has not been able to uh, elect the president. And so what happens is that Jefferson becomes president, Aaron Burr becomes his vice president, and John Adams will leave office after one term. The big thing, and the reason that this is called the Revolution of 1800, this election, is that, as you know, Adams and Jefferson are on two different sides of the political spectrum. And so people didn't know if Adams would willingly give up his power to his political rival. And when he did, this set a huge precedent that this kind of experiment in a Republican form of government is going to probably work, because everybody's playing by the rules, which is very important for if this is going to work. And so that's what happens later on. And what happens after the election takes place is that the Federalists will really be on their way out. They are tarnished by this undeclared war with France, and how they handled it with the Alien and Sedition Acts. And really, they are going the way of the dinosaur. They are on their way out. We will see that they will gasp for breath until about the end of the War of 1812. In that next presidential election will be the last time that a Federalist candidate will run. But they are kind of on their way out at this juncture. And so all of the dire predictions of the Federalists about Jefferson do not come to pass. Jefferson is actually quite a moderate when it comes to leading the government. He will not change a lot of the policies that were enacted under the Adams administration, and so a lot of the and that further kind of erodes the reputation of the Federalists, because the Federalists were basically saying the sky is going to fall if Jefferson becomes president, and that didn't happen. So that's kind of where we are as we head into Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson will serve two terms from 1801 to 1809. And one of the things that really comes out of this first is called the Midnight Appointments, and it leads to probably the most important court case in all of U.S. history, the 1803 Marbury v. Madison case. Now let's take a look at this story and see what happens. Well, Adams, as he began to realize that he was going to lose the election and that Jefferson was coming in, he wanted to try and shore up his power. And so what he does, and what the Congress does, is it passes a law called the Judiciary Act of 1801. This was an addendum to the Judiciary Act of 1789, which set up many of the federal courts, okay, as Article 3 mandated Congress to do, and Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution as well. And so what happens is that in this Judiciary Act of 1801, there were dozens and dozens of new federal courtships, judgeships that were enacted, and so many, in fact, that the judges could not be given their jobs officially before Adams had to leave office. And so what happens is that the new Secretary of State, James Madison, a close friend of Jefferson, you might remember the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, will be Secretary of State, and he's supposed to hand out these appointments to the federal bench, to the judges. He doesn't want to do this, and one of the and he refuses to do this. And one of the judges that's supposed to have a job under the Judiciary Act of 1801 is a guy named Marbury. Now, Marbury wants his job. Madison says no, and so it goes before the Supreme Court. Now, who is in charge of the Supreme Court at this time? It is a guy named John Marshall. John Marshall was concerned about drawing power to the federal government. And we'll see that that happens a whole lot during his tenure on the bench. And so what happens is, and John Marshall is also a Federalist. So everyone, including Marbury, and especially Marbury, assumes that he will just side with other Federalists and give Marbury his job. What happens is that John Marshall will do something that nobody expects. What he says is the Judiciary Act of 1801 is unconstitutional because it violates the Judiciary Act of 1789. And so in so doing, he is exerting something called judicial review, or reviewing laws based on the Constitution. And so basically what he does is he says, neither of you are right. The whole premise of this whole court case is unconstitutional, so get out of my basement. That's where they kept the third branch of government at this time. And this just amazed everybody, because what it did was it elevated the power of the judicial branch and did not side with either the Federalists or the Democratic Republicans. And so this was a huge deal and established the precedent, or the standard, of judicial review that is still used today by the court. And so this was a huge kind of power coup for the third branch of government. And so that was the case of Marbury v. Madison in 1803, which had everything to do with Jefferson's early time in office and the late Adams administration. Another thing that Jefferson had to deal with in the early part of his administration were pirates. Yes, pirates. You know that now that the United States is independent, it doesn't have a huge navy. It doesn't have a lot of power, and pirates, especially in the Mediterranean along the coast of North Africa, will really take advantage of this. The United States is not paying tribute to the pirates to let the ships go without getting attacked and that sort of thing. And the pirate in question particularly is the Dey of Algiers, D-E-Y of Algiers. And so what happens, long story short, is that there are these Barbary pirates, and the Marines are sent out to protect U.S. interests, and they do that in 1802-ish. And this is a real big win for the United States, because it kind of shows, for one of the first times, the U.S. military might abroad. And it was so influential that it made its way into the Marine song, where it says the shores of Tripoli. That is a reference to these Barbary pirates. So that is how Jefferson dealt with pirates back in the day. But what Jefferson was really interested in was the West. He had these crazy ideas as we look back at them today. It was kind of the best thinking of the day, but crazy ideas about what the West held. It was kind of like here on the Enterprise, when we encounter a planet, we don't know what we're going to encounter. We have scans of the planet and that sort of thing, but we have sometimes some pretty wrong ideas about what actually is on the planet. And that was the case with Jefferson and the West. He thought that things like the woolly mammoth existed in the West, that there was a mountain of salt somewhere in the West. He thought that there was this kind of parallel structure to to what is the United States. And so you have the Allegheny Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains on the East Coast. He thought there was a similar chain of small mountains on the West Coast. Now we know that these are the Rocky Mountains, and they're much bigger than the Appalachians, but he didn't know that. The big thing that you should know about his idea has to do with Native peoples. He had this belief, which was a fairly common belief in the day, that the lost settlers from Roanoke back in the 1580s, 1580, 87, actually came to what is today the United States. And over time, from the 1580s to now, he's in the 1800s, they intermarried and intermingled with the Native peoples. And so he believed that all of these Native peoples in the West had what he called Anglo blood in them. And he wanted to quote unquote awaken the Anglo blood in these Native peoples, so that then they would want to become farmers and help with Jefferson's agrarian vision of the future. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, that is totally racist, you are right. It is. He didn't really have much regard for Native customs or anything beyond this agrarian vision that he had. And so he had this just obsession with the West since he was just a boy, a 12-year-old boy, and he went to the meetings of the Virginia Philosophical Society with his father. And heard these fantastical stories about what might be in the West. And so when he became president and had the opportunity to have an expedition led to explore the West, he jumped on that. And circumstances will really help him out in all of this. Although he was planning this expedition prior to this, there is another set of events that will kind of legitimize in his mind this exploration. And that has to do with a guy named Toussaint L'Ouverture. Toussaint L'Ouverture is a Haitian slave. And you remember that Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, as it was known, was one of the only places that the French got to retain after the French and Indian War ended in 1763. You remember that they lost most of their land holdings in North America, but they had this island of Saint-Domingue, which is today Haiti, and there was, beginning in 1795, a slave uprising in Saint-Domingue, led by Toussaint L'Ouverture. And Napoleon, who comes to power around 1800 in France, wants to quash this slave rebellion and use Haiti as the hub for a new empire, a French empire in North America. And so what happens is Toussaint L'Ouverture is really a good tactician and really does a great job of leading his people. And so what happens is that Napoleon is not able to take Saint-Domingue. In addition to Toussaint L'Ouverture's leadership, what happens is that French troops will also get bloodborne diseases and die. And so this is very frustrating for the little guy with the complex in France. And so what happens is that at the same time that that's happening, Jefferson is very interested in securing the port at New Orleans for trade, for international trade. And France owns that port. It had been kind of given to France by Spain as repayment for a debt. And so what happens is that Jefferson will get permission to buy New Orleans and what was called West Florida for about $10 million. And so he sends a delegation over to France to negotiate with Napoleon for basically the port at New Orleans for up to $10 million. Napoleon is in no mood to negotiate. He's frustrated that he can't take Saint-Domingue. And what happens is he says, take it all. Now, what's all? Well, if you take a look at a map, it is basically a doubling of the size of the United States, or almost. And he says, take it all for $15 million. And that includes a lot of the West. And so this delegation of the United States hurries back to the United States and lets Jefferson know, well, we need $5 more million, but then we can almost double the size of the United States for about, I believe it was about 2.5 cents an acre, is what it turned out to be. Jefferson, who was a strict constructionist to the Constitution, who had ardently argued, oh my gosh, we can't do anything that the Constitution doesn't specifically give us power to do, he just ignores that and says, yeah, go for it. It was an offer too good to pass up, and his personal desire to see the West and to explore the West and have that explored really also factors into that. So the Louisiana Purchase is secured in 1803, and it is almost doubles the size of the United States for $15 million. There is a lot of dispute about where the western boundary of that land is. Spain thinks that land purchase is a lot smaller than the United States thinks it is, and so that will lead to some misunderstanding between those two countries. But that's kind of how we get the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. It is in this same time period that Jefferson will enlist, kind of volunteer, his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis. You are going to lead this expedition. Meriwether Lewis kind of freaks out about this. One, because Meriwether Lewis is prone to some melancholy, as he called it, so prone to some depression, and this is kind of an overwhelming thing for him. Also, Jefferson wanted to know everything, and there is no way that you can satisfy that appetite to know everything. And so this was a bigger job than any human could actually do. And so Meriwether Lewis kind of freaks out about this. And so he enlists his old captain from his military days, William Clark, and doesn't want to be outrank William Clark. And so he gets the president and Congress to sign on that these are co-captains, Lewis and Clark. And they start to advertise for a Corps of Discovery, and they will get their stuff together in 1803, and they will embark between 1804 and 1806. And this is just a fantastical journey. There are all sorts of things that happen. One thing of note, there are a couple of key players in all of this. One of them is a slave named York, and interestingly, he is one of William Clark's slaves, and he is treated rather like an equal on the voyage. His opinion is taken into consideration and that sort of thing. So that's good news. The bad news is that William Clark doesn't honor that kind of relative equality that he has in those 2 years when he gets back, and he will end up selling York, and York will die at the hands of a new owner, and it's really a tragic story. The other person of note on this journey is Sacagawea. Now, Sacagawea is a Shoshone young woman who was actually kind of a sex slave of a guy named Charbonneau. He won her in a card game, and he shows up to the expedition up at the Mandan villages, kind of where the river takes a turn, the Missouri River takes a turn and starts to go west. And she ends up saving them more than once. She will save them when Charbonneau, because he's prone to drink, he tips over one of the pirogues, the boats, and she, as a pregnant young woman, will get in the water and save a bunch of stuff. Also, when they come out of the Bitterroot Mountains, almost half starved after a long winter, they are met by a Shoshone war party, and like something out of a movie, the Shoshone are not happy that these stragglers are on their land. And then all of a sudden, what happens is that the leader of the Shoshone party looks over at Sacagawea and says, "Sister," and she says, "Brother," and there's this great moment of reuniting. She had been kidnapped some years before, and so instead of ending poorly, the Shoshone will help them get back on their way to their ultimate destination, which is the West Coast. And so it's just a fascinating story that Jefferson wanted to know everything about. Now, it does have, again, kind of like York, some more tragedy that happens afterward. Meriwether Lewis was supposed to write a compendium of a book about the journey, and that, from what we can tell, never happened. And near the end of Jefferson's second term in office, he calls Meriwether Lewis to Washington, D.C. to say, "What's going on here?" And on the way, Meriwether Lewis, who, as I mentioned before, was prone to some depression, probably took his own life. There's good evidence that happened. Historians do disagree about that some, but most historians think that he was so overwhelmed by having to face Jefferson and not having his homework done that he took his own life. And so a tragic end to a fantastical story, the Lewis and Clark expedition, or the Corps of Discovery. In terms of foreign relations, and this is where we'll kind of end today, both England and France are still battling it out, and the United States once again kind of gets caught in the middle. So in this case, Great Britain is continuing to kind of try to hem in the United States with these forts along the Ohio River Valley that we talked about before. And now that they're at war with France, what happens is that English warships, military ships, will begin boarding U.S. ships and taking both English subjects and U.S. citizens into the Navy for the British. This is called impressment, because there were instances of English mariners, sailors, trying to kind of hide from getting drafted into the Navy by posing as American sailors. And so that's happening, but the issue is that this is happening on our shores, or close to our shores, especially in 1807, something called the Chesapeake Incident. And this is a U.S. Merchant ship that is boarded by the HMS Leopard, a British military vessel, and U.S. sailors are taken for the British Navy in this time period. This makes the United States really angry, and so there begins to be a call for war. This is, of course, after Jefferson is reelected overwhelmingly with 92% of the electoral vote in 1804. So he is fairly popular, and so he kind of rides on that popularity a little bit in dealing with the Chesapeake incident and with impressment, and then also the Indian raids and the forts that are manned by the British in the Ohio River Valley. What Jefferson decides to do near the end of his second term is to create an embargo against British and later French shipping. This will affect Boston and New England much more than any other part of the United States. Now, of course, the Federalists go straight to conspiracy theory and say, oh, Jefferson is just trying to get back at us because we didn't support him in the election of 1800. They called the embargo the "Oh grab me" because it was holding back trade. That's "Oh grab me" is embargo spelled backwards. And so that's what they called this. And it really did hurt the United States much more than it hurt England or France. Now, France will take advantage of this in U.S. policy, because what will happen is, as the embargo is beginning to have a detrimental effect on U.S. trade, there will be new policies enacted by Congress. One is called the Non-Intercourse Act, and the other is called Macon's Bill No. 2. And basically what happens is that Napoleon will say, yeah, I'll follow all your rules, so we'll trade with you and you won't trade with England, which he had no intention of doing, but he just wanted to get back at England. And so the United States was really being taken advantage of by both England and France in the days and weeks and years leading up to the War of 1812. The War of 1812 will not start until Madison becomes president. He's elected in 1808, takes office in 1809, but the setup for it and the embargo really happens under the Jefferson administration. So this is the story of the Jefferson administration. I'm going to stop there, and then we will pick it up with the War of 1812 and James Madison, called Little Jimmy's War or Madison's War, next time. So I'm going to go ahead and beam out, and thanks for listening today, and we will see you soon.